Then, the book is entitled A Day in the Life of Jesus of Nazareth. Just to be confusing, the talk is entitled The World Where Jesus Walked, but it will be drawn from research that I did for the book. So today we're going to look at just that, the life and times of Jesus as he would have seen it, as he would have experienced it, growing up in Nazareth some 2,000 years ago. Just to say regarding sources, in my book, I think I've got about just over 330 endnotes. I draw from cutting-edge scholarship and archaeological sources, so I didn't just thumbsuck all this. It was extremely carefully researched, so anybody who wants to look at the data in further detail, you can have a look at the footnotes, the endnotes in my book. As far as ancient sources are concerned, I will be drawing from various Jewish and Gentile sources. Perhaps the most prominent of these, which I'll be quoting quite frequently, is called the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is a very famous collection of the sayings and wisdom of the Jewish rabbis over a period of about 500 years before, during, and after Jesus. It's an extremely interesting, very, very long tome, and it's very, very important, very essential for understanding the world in which Jesus walked. We can find many very interesting parallels that shed very valuable light on the things that Jesus said and did, and not only that, but throughout the New Testament as well. Right, first slide. No better place to start than by examining the broad context of the world where Jesus walked and having a look at the power play, the political power play as it existed in the first century. To put things, first of all, in a broad historical context, in 4 BC, the vile Herod the Great had done the world the great favor of dying, passing from this earth, and he'd left Israel to 3 of his sons, those who survived his terrible reign. I'll get to that in a moment. And consequently, his kingdom was divided into 3 territories, Israel divided into thirds. Just a word about Herod. He was completely deranged, very paranoid, a bit like Stalin in our own 20th century, where he reached such a level of paranoia that he thought everyone was out to get him. He saw assassins and everything, and he needlessly killed thousands of people, including many of those closest to him. So just a litany of Herod's ills. He had 10 sons altogether. He murdered 3 of them. Murdered 1 of his 10 wives, his own mother, 2 of his brothers-in-law, including one Aristobulus, who also happened to be the high priest. Caesar Augustus himself, who was the reigning emperor at the time, said of Herod, "It is better to be Herod's dog than one of his children." Anyway, if we can just go to the map now and just see how my nephew's just arrived. All right. If we can just see exactly how Israel was divided up into its thirds. Right, first of all, there, if you can just see that dark, that light green area at the bottom, that was the first of the thirds, and that went to 3 of his lucky sons who survived his murderous reign. The first of them was Archelaus, and Archelaus got that rather enormous chunk of Israel there. As you can see, it actually includes, it's called Judea, but it actually includes 3 areas, Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. But collectively, one just refers to it as Judea, the southern part of Israel, or Judea. And interestingly enough, Herod himself, the Herods came from Idumea, that region right at the bottom. Idumea is the New Testament word for Edom, where the Old Testament Edomites were from. They were descendants of Esau. Esau had started the Edomites. And so the great irony of that is that in the New Testament, you've got Israel ruled by a descendant of Esau, ruled by one of the fearsome Edomites who caused Israel so many problems in the Old Testament period. Now, the period, that region there to the east, the tetrarchy of Philip, that bit in green there, that went to the second son, Herod Philip. And we're not going to worry too much about that because Herod Philip doesn't feature too much as far as the Gospels are concerned. But we will be very interested in the third region, that little yellow region there called Galilee. And that went to the third of Herod's sons, Herod Antipas. And as it turns out, as we'll see later, Herod's capital in Galilee was a city called Sepphoris. which is very important. It's not mentioned in the New Testament, not mentioned in the Gospels, but it was only a stone's throw away from Nazareth, where Jesus was brought up. So we'll get into that a bit later, but obviously a very important locale. So as far as this talk is concerned, we're going to be concentrating on that region there, Galilee, ruled by Herod Antipas. Incidentally, that's the same Herod Antipas who had John the Baptist beheaded. It's the same Herod Antipas who presided, who was present at the time of the trial of Jesus, much later on. Right, the next section I was going to call Galilee or Judea, but taking into account what you know about history, I decided Galilee versus Judea might be a better title. It would be nice to think that just because Galileans and Judeans shared a common Jewish heritage, that they were on the same general spiritual and cultural wavelength. Unfortunately, from what we know from history, that was not the case. And there were many reasons why there was a serious rift between Judean and Galilean. First of all, historical. There was a disastrous exile in 721 BC, when at that stage Israel was divided into two kingdoms. It had split after the death of Solomon, and the northern kingdom, called the Kingdom of Israel, was destroyed by the Assyrians in 721 BC. They came down, they swept away all the Israelites, took them into exile. You've heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Well, those are the lost 10 tribes. They were taken off by the Assyrians and they never came back. They were lost to history. Then the Assyrians then replaced that northern part of the land with Gentile peoples. Now, in the course of history, Jews did come to re-inhabit that northern part, which would become Galilee in the New Testament. But somehow the Galileans could never quite shake that stigma that there was this Gentile taint, that they'd incurred this Gentile taint, and they weren't quite as pure as their Judean counterparts down south. Another important factor was that the capital of the land, Jerusalem, lay in the south, in the confines of Judea. Jerusalem, to the rabbis, was the center of the world. Literally, it was the place where God had his temple, his presence, the Holy of Holies. All the greatest rabbis in the land would congregate around the temple and feverishly debate the finer points of the Torah, the law. The law, by the way, is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis to Deuteronomy, which is called the law of Moses or the Torah. They feverishly debate its finer points. The fearsome zealots would center there, the zealots who were trying to cause an uprising against the Romans. And so Judeans and Jerusalemites alike regarded themselves as the spiritual elite of the land and pretty much looked down on the Galileans at the top, who were regarded as rough, callous, and somewhat boorish. What didn't help matters either is that the Galileans at the top, at the north, were not particularly concerned with observing every little jot and tittle of the law of the Torah. If they missed a couple of laws here and there, they weren't too concerned. They were a bit sluggish regarding that. And that of course, was greater cause for the Judeans in the south to look down their noses at their poor Galilean cousins. Invoking the Talmud itself gives some examples of this. There was a famous rabbi called Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, a very prominent figure in his time, and he undertook on himself the task of educating the Galileans as to the finer points of the law, the finer points of the Torah, for 18 years. And after having failed miserably, he declared, Galilee, Galilee, you hate the Torah. There's another slightly more amusing story of a hapless rabbi who was from Galilee himself, the so-called Yosei the Galilean. Now you wonder what the Jerusalemites in the south thought of poor old Rabbi Yosei, but in fact, although he was a Galilean, he was regarded with some respect. He did turn the heads of some of the famous rabbis of his day. Anyway, poor old Yosei made the cardinal mistake at one point of asking a woman the way to a place called Lydda. Lydda is about 15 kilometers to the southeast of modern-day Tel Aviv. It's on the left part of Israel. And now one thing, apologies up front, ladies, but one thing a staunch rabbi did not do in the first century was speak to a woman in the street. Sorry, that's just how it was. Anyway, Rabbi Yosei evidently didn't think too much of this rule, probably a good thing. And being a Galilean rabbi, I suspect this is not the only rule in which he was lax. Anyway, at this point it was the woman herself who turned around to poor Rabbi Yosef and screamed at him, "You stupid Galilean, have the sages not commanded, do not engage in a lengthy conversation with a woman?" Apparently the words Galilean and fool are paired quite often in the Talmud. You find them together quite often, which gives an indication once again of how the rabbis felt about the rough and ready Galileans up at the top. The other problem, interestingly enough, on a somewhat minor point, was the Galilean accent. The Galileans had a slightly odd accent and sounded rather odd to the Judeans down south. Perhaps a parallel could be drawn with modern Cockneys in London, with dropping their H's or something like that. Anyway, the Talmud records another story of a poor hapless Galilean who happened to go to market and asked to buy something, some item called an amar, A-M-A-R, not quite sure what that is. Unfortunately, he was ribbed mercilessly by the Judeans who heard him, and the conversation recorded in the Talmud ran something like this. The first Judean said to him, "You stupid Galilean," there's that phrase again, Galilean fool, "do you want something to ride on?" And we know that the Aramaic word for a donkey is a hamar, but obviously the way the Galilean was pronouncing amar, it could have come out in any number of ways. Another Judean said to him, "Or do you want something to drink?" And the word for wine is the word hamar, obviously slightly different from the donkey hamar. And so it goes down the line. Another Judean said, "Maybe you want something for clothing." And the word for wool is another very similar word, amar. Likewise, do you want something for sacrifice? Another one asked, and the word for lamb is imar. So this poor Galilean peasant ribbed mercilessly by the Judeans, and one gets the impression that this was quite an often thing. This has happened quite often, quite a common thing. Such so that when Galileans were in Judea down south, they were asked not to read the scriptures in public. We actually find one or two examples of the Galilean accent in the Gospels themselves. Matthew chapter 26 records the account of the trial of Jesus. Jesus has just been arrested, he's on trial, and Peter's trying to stay cavey, and he's trying to keep warm in the courtyard, trying to warm himself by the fire. And we read in verse 73 of Matthew 26, "Those standing there went up to Peter and said, 'Surely you are one of them, your accent gives you away.'" So the Galilean accent, very sharp, very easily contrasted with the Judean accent. Now, there's a very good quote from a well-known scholar, R.T. France, who gives a very good summary of the differences as they existed between Judea and Galilee in the first century, and he writes, "It means that even an impeccably Jewish